Hi everyone. Laudetur Jesus Christus in saecula saeculorum. Okay, welcome to part two of a 10-part series in which I'm going to be reading The Way of Perfection by St. Teresa of Avila. I am a secular Discalced Carmelite, but in formation. Okay, so this you should consider it to be work in progress. I'm both learning about the spirituality and incorporating it into my own life. And I suspect that in the future, when I come back to these lectures, I may want to redo them because I'll know more than I know now. But in the meantime, this is a good way for me to organize my thoughts, and I might be useful to you as well. Okay. Basically, what I'm going to be doing is going through the text, making comments on the text, and lifting quotes from the text. But I'm going to have the computer read the text using text to speech. It'll break up my voice, and also it's a little bit easier on my eyes. Okay. All of the notes that you're going to see are actually online on a blog, carmelite.freeskies.net, and you could see the notes there. That blog will be dedicated only to this channel and the exposition of Carmelite spirituality. Okay, let's begin. So, last time we went through the introduction, or actually the prologue, up to chapter 4. And there, St. Teresa didn't actually jump directly into contemplative prayer. What she did was she actually just started discussing the necessary conditions for contemplative prayer. But in her typical style, she started to digress and start to talk about the importance of having a good confessor. And so she continues with that in chapter 5. Now, in chapter 6, she will come back to the necessary conditions for contemplative prayer. But she feels that this is a very important topic, and even though we're not nuns in a monastery, you could see how these everything that she has to say here is of importance in our own lives in picking a good confessor or a spiritual director. Okay, so let's go through these points. The first thing that she's worried about is too much familiarity between the confessor and the prioress. Okay, and she's worried that the sisters, in order to preserve the honor of one or the other, might be afraid to speak frankly about the other person because it would, harm their honor, and this could be to the detriment of of this one's soul. Okay, so you could see how this could also be important in our lives, why we might want to choose a confessor who doesn't, where we wouldn't have to worry about holding back when we are confessing. Okay, so here's what she has to say about that.
Nor may he allow a situation in which if the prioress gets along well with the confessor no one dares to speak either to him about her or to her about him. The result of this state of affairs will be the temptation to omit the confession of very serious sins for fear of being disturbed.
O God help me, what harm the devil can cause here,
and how dearly the nuns will pay for this restriction and concern about honor. For while they think that by dealing with no more than one confessor they are doing something great for religious life and the reputation of the monastery, the devil manages in this way to catch souls, since he cannot in any other.
Okay, so here she is worried about what might be a deterrent to speaking clearly about serious sins. Okay, and if the confessor is familiar with the people that you're speaking about. Okay, not that you're confessing their sins, but in confessing your own sins. Okay, now what she continues with is she's worried about the nuns being able to choose between confessors. And in those days, confessors were often appointed to a monastery. And so she was worried that the sisters, might be stuck with a confessor that was not really adequate to their needs. Okay. And especially, she wanted them to have access to learned people who could teach them and advise the sisters on the contemplative life. Okay. And so here's what she has to say about that.
May she always ask permission from the bishop or the provincial that, besides speaking with the ordinary confessors, she and all the others might sometimes speak and discuss their souls with learned persons, especially if the confessors, however good, may not be learned. Learning is a great help for shedding light upon every matter.
All right. So she's talking about the importance of having these learned people who are advanced enough in the contemplative life that they would be able to advise the sisters. And this does not have to be the confessor. So what we would call today a spiritual director. Okay. Now, you might wonder, why was Saint Teresa this worried about her? What prompted her in a lot of her discussions, even though she's not referring to a specific situation, she is talking out of experience. And so here's where she discusses that.
It happened to me that I spoke about matters of conscience with a confessor who had gone through the whole course of theology, and he did me a great deal of harm by telling me that some matters didn't amount to anything. I know that he didn't intend to misinform me and had no reason to, but he simply didn't know any more. And the same thing happened to me with 2 or 3 others, besides the one I mentioned.
So she felt that she had not been advised well. Okay, and it sounds to me that that they weren't challenging her as much as she wished. Okay, and so she feels that you could be stuck with a bad a confessor who's not adequate to your needs, and as a remedy, she says, well, then you should have the ability to at least, if you can't speak with your confessor, to at least speak with some spiritual and learned person as a spiritual advisor. Okay.
Having true light at our disposal for the sake of keeping the law of God with perfection is all our good. Prayer is well founded on such light. Without this strong foundation, and if the sisters are not given freedom to confess and discuss their souls with persons like those I have mentioned, the whole building will be wobbly. Thus they must speak to spiritual and learned persons. If the appointed confessor is not spiritual and learned, they should at times seek out others.
Okay, so there you could see that she's really speaking to the importance of having a spiritual advisor, someone that could guide you, or she's speaking of our sisters, but we could take this into our own lives and say it's someone that can advise us and how we are to progress in a contemplative life. Okay, so Saint Teresa was also sensitive to the fact that there are different paths to God. And she wasn't saying that one confessor is necessarily better than the other, but because there are these different paths, the confessor that you might have to go to just may not know much about the contemplative life. Okay, and so there are different paths, and it's important to seek out someone who is familiar with the contemplative life. All right, here's what she asked.
For there are different paths along which God leads souls, and one confessor perhaps will not know them all.
Um, so there you go. Now, she actually went so far as to suggest that, having a spiritual advisor may even be a way of keeping your confessor honest. Okay. And so she's saying, they would be less likely, less tempted to give a bad advice if they know that you're actually, you know, um, discussing these matters with someone else. All right. Again, I don't know what she's referring to here, but she makes an interesting point. All right, here's what she asked.
For even if the devil tempts a confessor so as to deceive him about some doctrine, he will be careful and consider with caution everything he does when he knows that you speak to others.
All right. Finally, it turns out that in this entire matter herself, St. Teresa took her own advice, and it turns out that she discussed the question of having multiple advisors, confessors, and advisors with people that were spiritual and learned persons. Okay, so she's not only suggesting this for other people, but she's saying, I myself actually, discuss this matter, and whether it's a good idea for nuns in a monastery.
I have seen and understood what I have mentioned here, and discussed it with learned and holy persons who have considered what was most suitable for this house so that there would be progress along the path of perfection.
All right. So, some wise advice for how we might choose our confessors and or spiritual advisor. Okay, turning to chapter 6, she returns to the question of love. Okay, now when she was talking about it in chapter 4, she spent a lot of time talking about excessive love, which is a form of defective love with too much attachment to creatures and not to God. Okay, but here she's going to return to the question of love and also detachment and pick up on the theme of what are the necessary conditions before you enter into contemplative prayer. Okay, now it's worth before we jump into that to re-listen to the quote from chapter 4 in which she discusses that. Okay.
Before I say anything about interior matters, that is, about prayer, I shall mention some things that are necessary for those who seek to follow the way of prayer. If they do not possess them, it is impossible for them to be very contemplative. The practice of these three things helps us to possess inwardly and outwardly the peace our Lord recommended so highly to us. The first of these is love for one another, the second is detachment from all created things, the third is true humility, which, even though I speak of it last, is the main practice and embraces all the others.
Okay, so the three things are once again love for one another, detachment from all created things, and true humility. Okay, so like I said before, chapter 5, she was beginning to talk about love, but she was concentrating on this issue of excessive love. Okay, and what she turns to in chapter 5 is she's now going to concentrate not so much on the defective forms of love, but on perfect love, what she calls perfect love. Okay, and here's her quote there.
Now it seems to me that those whom God brings to a certain clear knowledge love very differently than do those who have not reached it. This clear knowledge is about the nature of the world, that there is another world, about the difference between the one and the other, that the one is eternal and the other a dream, or about the nature of loving the Creator and loving the creature, and this seen through experience, which is entirely different from merely thinking about it or believing it, or this knowledge comes from seeing and feeling what is gained by the one love and lost by the other, and what the Creator is and what the creature is, and from many other things that the Lord teaches to anyone who wants to be taught by Him in prayer, or whom His Majesty desires to teach.
Okay, so seemingly cryptic quote, but actually very important. She's making a distinction between love of the Creator and love of His creation. Okay, and this is going to become the foundation of what she's going to discuss later. Okay, so she's given this soft definition of what she's going to talk about as perfect love. Okay, but it's as I said, cryptic and you might say incomplete, and you might wonder what is she talking about. She talks about the nature of loving the Creator and loving the creature. Well, what is that nature? Okay, and so the remainder of this chapter 6 and into chapter 7 and further, she's actually going to unpack this. Okay, and the way she actually unpacks it is by multiplying examples of perfect love, not so much giving a positive definition, is to give examples that will bring out what is meant in this quote. Okay, so she talks about these majestic souls, people who have come to this point where they can um, where they are exhibiting perfect love. Okay, and these are people that are they're not content with merely loving bodies, what you might call creatures. Okay, but they ultimately see the Creator behind all of the beautiful creatures of this world. Okay, so even though they may be attracted to uh, these creatures, they're ultimately attracted because they see God as the cause behind them. Okay, and so she's going to try to unpack this. It's not a very easy idea to understand, but with the multiplication of her examples, I think it comes across clearly. Okay, so let's listen to what she says there.
Yes, it pleases them to see such bodies, and they praise the Creator, but, no, they do not stop there. I mean stop in such a way that they love these things. It would seem to them that they were loving something of no substance, loving a shadow.
Okay, so yeah, you might be attracted to somebody. Now, here she's not necessarily talking about the human body. It could be any created object, okay, or even a person, someone that you love in your life, some relative or acquaintance. But you don't stop at just loving the person, okay, because if to do so would be, as she says, it would be as if you're loving something of no substance, a mere shadow, okay. So their love passes through that created thing to the ultimate cause, which is the creator. Okay, so what follows in this chapter and the next are a series of elucidations about what this perfect love is. Okay, so the first is that they're not attracted. So these are these majestic souls, okay, that exhibit perfect love. They are not attracted to the affections of others. That's not why they love them, okay. Nonetheless, even though they don't love in the expectation of a returned affection, okay, a requited affection, they're not ungrateful for any love that they receive back, and they recommend these people to God. Okay.
All other affection wearies these persons, for
They understand that no benefit comes from it and that it could be harmful. But this does not make these persons ungrateful or unwilling to repay the love of others by recommending them to God. They entrust to the Lord the care of those who love them, for they understand that the love comes from Him.
Uh, the other thing is that when they are loved by others, they don't think of it as them being loved because of some lovable quantity within them. Rather, they experience the love that others have for them, the love that person has for the sake of God. So they think that other people love them for God's sake and not because of some special quality that they hold within themselves.
It doesn't seem there is anything within themselves to love, and they immediately think they are loved because these others love God. They leave it to His Majesty to repay those who love them, and they beg Him to do so. In this way they remain free, for it seems to them that repaying the love is not their business.
So it's actually the last point she makes there, that repaying the love is not their business. They don't feel an attachment. Okay, that the the returning of the love is then becomes an occasion for some kind of inordinate attachment. Okay, so um, they're not really seeking after some kind of satisfaction when they love other people. Okay, they are looking for no consolation except for the consolation that might come from God.
Now, note well that when we desire love from some person, there is always a kind of seeking our own benefit or satisfaction, and these perfect persons have already trampled underfoot all the good things and comforts the world has to offer them. Their consolations are of a kind that even though they may desire them, so to speak, they cannot tolerate having them apart from God or from speaking of Him. For what benefit can come to them from being loved?
All right. So they might recall that in the past they might have suffered from having some unrequited love, for loving someone and then not receiving that love in return. But once they've reached this level of perfection, they start to recognize that that was really in vain, and it's not really love if there's an expectation of some kind of satisfaction or consolation coming back.
They laugh at themselves because of the affliction they once suffered as to whether or not their love was repaid. Although our affection is good, the desire that it be repaid is very natural. But once we receive the payment, we realize that the pay is all straw.
nonetheless, when they love without expectation. Okay, and that doesn't mean that they're detached from wanting to give. They want to give and they want to love, but without any expectation in return. And in fact, this is what Saint Teresa says is the only real and true love.
It will seem to you that such persons do not love or know anyone but God.
I say,
Yes, they do love, with a much greater and more genuine love, and with passion, and with a more beneficial love. In short, it is love. And these souls are more inclined to give than to receive. Even with respect to the Creator himself, they want to give more than to receive.
I say that
This attitude is what merits the name love, for these other base attachments have usurped the name love.
Okay. Um, what she's suggesting that these majestic souls do is that they look at the other person and they look for what is eternal and lovable in the other person in the hopes that they'll be together in all eternity with God. Okay, and so they're not really attached to any kind of transient elements or transient attributes in the other person, but they're really looking at the eternal soul and the well-being of that eternal soul.
It is true that what they see they love and what they hear they become attached to, but the things that they see are stable. As soon as these persons love, they go beyond the bodies and turn their eyes to the soul and look to see if there is something to love in the soul. Nothing could be presented to them that they wouldn't eagerly do for the good of this soul, for they desire to continue loving it, but they know that if it does not love God very much and have His blessings, their loving it is impossible.
And finally, she says this perfect love is an imitation of the love of Christ. Okay, and this is the a very self-sacrificing love, which would ultimately be willing to lay down your life for a friend.
Well, now in the case of perfect love, if a person loves, there is the passion to make the other soul worthy of being loved, for, as I say, this person knows that otherwise he will not continue to love the other. It is a love that costs dearly. This person does everything he can for the other's benefit. He would lose 1,000 lives that a little good might come to the other soul.
O precious love that imitates the Commander-in-Chief
Of love, Jesus, our good.
All right, so this ends chapter 6, in which she gives this kind of a cryptic definition or packed definition of perfect love, and then it begins to unpack it in terms of examples. And all of the examples are of this perfect love, which is very much centered on the other. Okay, but the other not because of the attributes that they might have in and of themselves, but for the sake of God's love for them. All right. Chapter 7 is actually a continuation of this, where she again continues multiplying examples which elucidate the kind of perfect love that she's talking about. Okay, so the centering on the other person and the spiritual growth of the other person, okay, and the perfecting of the other person is very important. Okay, so she talked a minute ago about the fear of losing the other person. Well, that doesn't just mean in this world, but also into eternity. And so she makes that clear in the next.
It is not happy unless it sees that person make progress. It is always fearful lest the soul it loves so much be lost and the two be separated forever. Death here below matters nothing to it, for it doesn't want to become attached to anything that in a mere moment escapes from one's hand and cannot be grasped again. It is, as I said, a love with no self-interest at all.
All that it desires or wants is to see the other soul rich with heavenly blessings.
So the eternal health of the other soul is of paramount importance to the person that's exhibiting this perfect love. Okay, in fact, so much so that it's not a superficial love. It'll actually be content to see the other soul undergoing trials, as long as those trials are good for the other soul and they are able to sustain it. Okay, nonetheless. These majestic souls would be more than willing to suffer for the other if they could only pass that merit on to them.
Reason immediately considers whether the trial is good for the one loved, whether there is an enrichment in virtue, and how that soul bears the suffering. It asks God to give the other patience and merit in the trials. If this love sees that the other person has patience, no distress is felt, rather it rejoices and is consoled. This love would much rather suffer the trial itself than see the other suffer it, if the merit and gain that lies in suffering could be given to the other entirely, but not because this love is disquieted and disturbed.
So this is not at all a cowardly love that'll shy away from suffering, either suffering itself or seeing suffering in the other. Okay, as long as that suffering is beneficial. Okay, to the other. All right, and she even goes further. She says this love is requires a very deep intimacy between people, okay, and is not afraid to correct the other person in even the smallest matter, not because of any kind of annoyance that one might feel, but simply because they want to see that soul progressing always towards a spiritual perfection.
These lovers cannot in their hearts be insincere with those they love. If they see them deviate from the path or commit some faults, they immediately tell them about it. They cannot help but do so. And since they are not going to change their attitude, nor are they going to flatter or hide anything from the other, either that other person mends his ways or the friendship is broken. For these lovers cannot suffer such a thing, nor should it be suffered.
So there's quite an intimacy that's required here, okay, for this kind of a friendship to continue. And if that intimacy isn't there, and they're not able to correct one another in these small matters, again, for the sake of progressing in towards spiritual perfection, if that intimacy isn't there, then the friendship simply can't continue. Okay, she makes that clear in the next quote.
There is a continual war between the two attitudes these lovers have. On the one hand, they go about forgetful of the whole world, taking no account of whether others serve God or not, but only keeping account of themselves. On the other hand, with their friends, they have no power to do this, nor is anything covered over, they see the tiniest speck. I say that they bear a truly heavy cross.
So you couldn't possibly just go out to someone in the world that you don't know and start to correct them on matters of any kind, especially not on spiritual matters or moral matters. It wouldn't work. They would say, "Who are you?" and ask you to go away. But with these friends, they are so they love one another so much, and their spiritual perfection is of such importance that they actually would welcome those kinds of corrections. Okay, and Saint Teresa says you should highly praise this kind of a friendship.
Love such persons as much as you like. They must be few, but the Lord does desire that it be known when someone has reached perfection. I know through experience, after the Lord, it is because of persons like these that I am not in hell, for I was always very attached to their praying for me, and so I strove to get them to do this. Now let us return to our subject.
So you could see here that Saint Teresa herself was very grateful for the kinds of corrections that she received from people that loved her in this way with this perfect love. Okay, and you might remember that in the previous chapter she was talking about confessors that had minimized her sins and given her bad advice as a result, and you could see here that that the contrast with someone who really loves you is not going to be afraid to tell you what you need in order to progress along the path towards spiritual perfection. Okay, so she does change the direction a little bit uh, and starts to talk about the compassion that is in perfect love. She next counsels us not to judge other people's weakness, but to remember our own weakness that we overcame, not of our own efforts, but by the graces of God. Okay, and we should not be so proud as to think that we overcame some of those weaknesses, that we overcame these weaknesses ourselves. But remember that that it was God's grace that helped us, and this will avoid us from becoming cold towards others.
If you are not like them, do not fail to be compassionate. And perhaps our Lord desires to exempt us from these sufferings, whereas in other matters we will suffer. And those sufferings that for us are heavy, even if in themselves they truly are, may be light for another. So in these matters let us not judge from ourselves, nor let us think that we are at a stage in which perhaps the Lord without our own effort has made us stronger, but let us think of the stage we were at when we were weaker. Consider that this advice is important for knowing how to sympathize with your neighbor in his trials, however small they may be. This is especially true in the case of those souls that were mentioned. Since they desire trials, they make little of everything, and it is very necessary that they take the time to remember how they themselves were once weak, and that if they are not weak now, their strength doesn't come from themselves. For it could be that the devil by this means will make charity toward one's neighbor grow cold, and make us think that what in reality is a fault belongs to perfection.
So don't be proud of your spiritual strengths, okay? Uh, they're good, but that good ultimately came from God. And when we see others that lack in them, we should be compassionate to them. All right. Um, Perfect love will take time for another person, even in such mundane things as recreation, because love requires us spending time with one another. And so she advises in that direction.
Strive also to take time for recreation with the sisters when there is need and during the time set aside for it by custom, even though this may not be to your pleasure, for everything done with a pure intention is perfect love.
She also counsels against too much pity. It's okay to take pity on another person's situation, but we ought to exercise some discretion in when we feel sorry for another person and when we don't. And you can see why, because trials that other people are going through are often, as she said earlier, might be for their benefit.
Thus, it is very good that some take pity on others in their need. Let them take care that there be no lack of discretion in things that would go against obedience. And learn how to understand which are the things one ought to feel sorry about and take pity on with regard to the sisters.
The next point she makes is kind of an obvious point. I think most of us know it, uh, but it's worth repeating here. Perfect love is going to be tolerant of other people's faults because, after all, we all have faults, and we may not always see the faults in ourselves. We see the faults in other people, and these faults may not even be faults of um, spiritual imperfections. They might just simply be personality quirks, and so these are things that perfect love allows us to be tolerant of.
Here love shows itself, and it is practiced well when you know how to suffer the fault and not be surprised, so the others will do with respect to your faults, for you may have many more than you are aware of.
She also suggests that we correct other people's faults by actually fixing them in ourselves first, okay? And then teaching others by the examples that we have, all right?
Recommend the sister to God and strive yourself to practice with great perfection the virtue opposite the fault that appears in her. Make every effort to do this so that you teach that sister indeed what perhaps through words or punishment she might not understand or profit by, and the imitation of the virtue in which one sees another excel has a great tendency to spread. This is good advice, don't forget it.
Uh, Also, St. Teresa was worried about false flatteries, and you can imagine in 16th century Spain that this might have been a common cultural quirk that they had to, indulge in these kind of false flatteries with one another. And this struck St. Teresa as insincere and said, no, you shouldn't be like that.
Oh,
How good and true will be the love of the sister who can help others by setting aside her own advantage for their sake. Better friendship will this be than all the tender words that can be uttered, for these are not used, nor should they be used, in this house, those like, my life, my soul, my only good, and other similar expressions addressed now to one, now to another, of the sisters. Keep these words of affection for your spouse.
She was also worried about the sisters doing their chores in the monastery, and again, as seculars, we probably don't have that sort of a situation. We don't live in a monastery, but we do have this a similar situation with our household, the family, and so it's important to do your share of the work around the house, and also she connected to rejoicing in seeing another sister grow in virtue.
Another very good proof of love is that you strive in household duties to relieve others of work, and also rejoice and praise the Lord very much for any increase you see in their virtues.
And she finally closes off this section on, or this entire chapter, which was like a litany of one example after another of how perfect love exhibits itself. With something that reminds me of St. Benedict's rule, and that is counseling against grumbling and petty resentments. And she notes very clearly that these petty resentments can become poison in a monastery, as they can within our families, and so it's important to root them out and fix them as soon as possible.
If by chance some little word should escape, try to remedy the matter immediately and pray intensely. And if things of this sort against charity continue, such as little factions, or ambition, or concern about some little point of honor,
oh,
how great an evil it is.
God deliver us from the monastery where it enters.
I would rather that the monastery catch fire and all be burned.
A bit of an exaggeration, but you could see how she was very much worried about what would happen if these kind of petty resentments would set themselves in. Okay, uh, that's the end of chapter 7. Let's continue with chapter 8. And in chapter 8, uh, St. Teresa once again uh, presents us with the conditions for contemplative prayer, and just to remind you, that's love, detachment, and humility. And she's dealt with love in chapters 6 and 7. Well, even earlier when she was talking about excessive love, but in 6 and 7 she was, which we just went over, she was talking about perfect love. And in chapter 8 she turns towards detachment. And detachment for her means embracing the Creator and not caring for the whole of creation, the way she puts it. Okay, there is a withdrawing from the world, and she tells us that God, in this withdrawing, God will infuse us with the virtues we need to grow with actually little struggle from us. Okay, so it's not really a path of asceticism, of heroic asceticism, the way you might see in St. Anthony of the Desert. Rather, this is more of a gentle path, where she actually does say that it's with little struggle, but we have to, at the very least, begin to withdraw our attention from the world and focus our attention, embrace the creator. Okay, so this is her understanding of detachment, which again, in her first foray into the definition, is a bit packed, but then we'll unpack that throughout the chapter and actually throughout her work.
Now let us talk about the detachment we ought to have, for detachment, if it is practiced with perfection, includes everything. I say it includes everything because if we embrace the Creator and care not at all for the whole of creation, His Majesty will infuse the virtues. Doing little by little what we can, we will have hardly anything else to fight against. It is the Lord who in our defense takes up the battle against the demons and against the world.
So again, this is not exactly a heroic form of asceticism where we go out and battle against the demons and against the world with our own strength. Rather, what we're going to do is we're going to, in withdrawing and detaching from this world, from the world, we're going to make room in our own hearts for God, who will then fill it and infuse it with the virtues required to do the battle. And so, in a sense, He'll be doing the battle for us, through us. Okay, so the key here is to really clear out our hearts of the worldly clutter, as I put it. Okay, here Saint Teresa is really, giving us a good understanding of how created things can become a hindrance to unity with God. Okay, and she's actually very grateful because in her monastery, she and her sisters are able to become separated from everything so that they can have this kind of a withdrawal from the world.
With regard to externals, obviously we are separated here from everything. I think the Lord wants all of us He has gathered together in this house to withdraw from everything so that His Majesty may unite us to Himself here without any hindrance.
O my Creator and Lord,
when did I merit such honor? For it seems you went a roundabout way to bring us closer to yourself. May it please your goodness that we do not lose through our own fault this nearness to you.
O sisters, understand, for the love of God,
the great favor the Lord has granted those whom He brought here.
So, in saying this, she's not only talking about withdrawal or detachment from material possessions, she's also talking about a detachment from people. Okay, and she's grateful about the fact that Saint Joseph, which she founded as a Discalced Carmelite monastery, actually only had 12 nuns, okay, plus the prioress. All right. Whereas compared to the Incarnation, where she first entered the Carmelite order, where she was living with over 180 other nuns, okay, and she felt that the din of having so many people in the monastery was actually also a hindrance to unity with God. Okay, and so she wanted not only a detachment from the material things, but also a detachment from people, so that there was more of a solitude and isolation, hearkening back something to the primitive rule of the Carmelites, referring to the hermits of Mount Carmel in the Holy Land.
Instead of keeping me where there were so many living together and where my wretchedness would not have been so clearly seen during my lifetime, you have brought me to a place where, since there are so few nuns, it seems impossible for this wretchedness not to be known. That I might walk more carefully, you have removed from me all opportunities to conceal it. Now I confess there is no longer an excuse for me, Lord, and so I have greater need of your mercy that you might pardon any fault I may have.
So you could see that there is something about the quiet, where there's only the bare soul and God, where every imperfection is made and manifest. Okay, and so she's seeing when there are too many people, there's too many opportunities for you to conceal these things in the relationships that you have with other people. Whereas when you're in that solitude, there's no possibility of that concealment. Okay, and she's actually very grateful for that because it allowed that solitude. And of Saint Joseph allowed her to actually have all of those imperfections exposed.
In other places there is the freedom to find relief by being with relatives. Here, if some relatives are allowed to visit, it is that they might find relief by being with us. But the nun who desires to see them for her own consolation, if these relatives are not spiritual persons, should consider herself imperfect. She ought to believe that she is not detached, not healthy, she will not possess freedom of spirit, she will not possess complete peace. She needs a doctor, and I say that if this attachment is not removed and she is not cured, she is not meant for this house.
So you could see how this dynamic works out. If you're with a lot of people, and here Saint Teresa is referring to relatives because it was a practice in those days for the nuns to be around their relatives more than they should have been. If you start to look for consolation in these relationships, then that's a problem. Okay, the consolation should ultimately come from God, and if you're looking for that, if you have that kind of an attachment, and you could see maybe this in your own lives where you might have attachment to a lot of people or being with people, okay, the flight from wanting to be alone, the fear of being alone, that is a problem, okay, and she actually sees it as a kind of a spiritual illness, where she actually says, the sister needs a doctor, and if she doesn't want to be cured of this, then this path is not for her.
She needs a doctor, and I say that if this attachment is not removed and she is not cured, she is not meant for this house. The best remedy I know is that she not see them until obviously she is free and obtains this freedom from the Lord through much prayer. When it is clear that she considers these visits a cross, it will be all right for her to see them, for then she will be of benefit to her relatives and not be harmed herself.
So the emphasis here is important. It's not that Saint Teresa doesn't want her sisters to see her relatives. It's that she doesn't want her sisters to find consolation in her relatives because she sees this as an inordinate attachment. Rather, if the sisters are a sister is already detached in this way, then seeing the relatives might be a benefit to them, but it's a problem if it becomes a benefit to the sister. Okay, that ends chapter 8 on detachment, and she continues in chapter 9 with more about detachment, and in particular detachment from relatives. Okay.
I don't know what it is in the world that we renounce when we say that we give up everything for God if we do not give up the main thing, namely, our relatives.
So you might wonder what it is about the relatives that St. Teresa's worrying about. Okay, and what it is it's not so much that our relatives are going to be mischievous or whatever, but our relatives, they live in the world. So you might even in your life you might say, well, it's not so much relatives; it might be your colleagues or other people, your acquaintances in your life. Okay, their lives are rooted in the world. Okay, and if you start to have too much in association with them, they're going to draw you into that world of concern. Okay, especially with respect to familial reciprocity, things like I don't know, having going out together or something like that, okay, where you feel obliged to the other person. And these things draw you in to a worldly life, a life entrenched in worldly concerns, whereas the nuns were supposed to be, of course, free from that and directing their lives towards God. Okay, and so it's really that the relatives would draw the sisters into a world of familiar reciprocity and thus take them away from God.
In this house, daughters, great care should be taken to recommend them to God, that is right. As for the rest, we should keep them out of our minds as much as possible, because it is a natural thing for the will to become attached to them more than to other persons. For since these seek to be repaid by God, they do things for us. Those who seek to be repaid by us soon grow tired, since they see that we are poor and unable to help them in any way. And although this may not be universally so, it is now more usually so, for after all, the world is the world.
So St. Teresa gives a remedy for this, and the remedy is um, because our relatives or acquaintances make us cling to the world, what we should do is embrace Jesus with determination, okay? And as she puts it, in him everything is found and everything is forgotten, okay? She also says it helps to withdraw bodily until we know that truth. So it's not necessary that uh, go live in a hermitage or something like that to withdraw, although that might be helpful in the beginning until that truth begins to manifest and entrench itself in your life. And then, even if there are people around you, you don't get caught up in their worldly concerns. Okay?
All that the saints counsel us about fleeing the world is clearly good.
Well, believe me, our relatives are what clings to us most from the world, as I have said, and the most difficult to detach ourselves from. What helps is that the soul embrace the good Jesus our Lord with determination, for since in him everything is found, in him everything is forgotten. Yet, it is a very great help to withdraw even bodily until we have come to know this truth.
Okay, so that ends chapter 9, and that ends the chapters that I'm going to go over in this lecture. It is difficult to summarize St. Teresa because of her digressions in various points, all of which, as you could see, are important, but not always as directly related thematically. Okay, nonetheless, I'm going to make an effort at the end of these to say what kind of nugget of wisdom ties them all together. And so here's my concluding remarks for this section, okay? So before entering into a discussion of contemplative prayer, St. Teresa felt it necessary that her sisters have a correct disposition. As she explains, without love for one another, detachment from all created things, and true humility, it is impossible to be very contemplative and possess the peace recommended by our Lord. Previously, she began her discussion of love with warnings against the dangers of excessive love, a love marked by a disoriented attachment to others. In these chapters, she turns her discussion to the question of perfect love and detachment, the two being related to one another. Okay? So, perfect love entails an experiential knowledge of the difference between loving the Creator and loving His creatures. Detachment doesn't mean that we abstain from loving one another. Rather, we love one another in loving God, for the sake of loving God who loves them, and with the same self-sacrificial love with which God loves. Okay? To love a creature in isolation from loving his or her creator, we are imbuing the finite object of our affection with with expectations of God. We make them into an idol, which is sure to disappoint. Okay? Properly ordered love is always love directed to the eternal through his creatures. Let's close with a Hail Mary, and that'll end this lecture. Okay? Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Okay, God bless and bye-bye.